Good afternoon. Payment system governance and regulation. What an amazing way to end the online series for the Point 2022 today. Thank you again for joining us, the delegates, and thanks for sticking with us during the day. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors for the Point 2022 for their support as well. Please note that both Simon and Scott are happy to take questions during the session, so please put that on the app as we go through, and we'll make those questions known and see what the answers come back at. So thank you, gents. Thank you. Look, firstly, I'd like to introduce Scott Farrell. Now, Scott is a senior partner at King & Wood Mallesons, with more than 25 years' experience in the law of financial market systems. Scott led 2 inquiries for the Australian government, which designed and developed the framework for Australia's consumer data right and chaired the review into the regulatory architecture of Australia's payment system. So there's not too much that Scott does not know about those topics. Scott is an adjunct professor of law at the University of New South Wales and has been appointed to the Payment System Board of the Reserve Bank of Australia. Welcome, Scott, and thank you for joining us here all the way from sunny Sydney.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And Simon Jensen. Simon is a payment consultant with over 30 years' experience within the payment industry. Simon is an adjunct lecturer at the Victoria University of Wellington, Te Hiranga Waka, in banking and finance law, a course which includes sections on payment systems, consumer data rights and cryptocurrencies. He is also currently a member of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's CBDC Forum. Simon, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Tēnā katoa. Look, it's my pleasure this afternoon to be chatting with Scott Farrell here. I understand that since Scott's been in New Zealand, it's become customary to use the definite article before his name when introducing him to regulators, at least.
No comment.
Right.
No comment.
So look, thank you this afternoon. And look, as Steve has mentioned, Scott's prepared in the last 5 years, has done 2 reports for the Australian government. What I would like to do today is focus probably equally on both, but I'll start with the report on the payment system and payments in Australia, and probably better called ecosystem, I suspect. And then like to spend perhaps the second half of it on open banking, something which I guess has become a bit more topical after the Minister announced it today. Mike Rick-Roberts, I think, announced it 2 days ago, but there we go. So the second part of it on open banking and the CDR in New Zealand. What I'm kind of hoping, and there was a mention yesterday, I think, of a Maori proverb about your basket of knowledge and my basket of knowledge, and or New Zealand and Australia's baskets of knowledge in this case, leading to better outcomes. So I'm hoping that we will able to operate in accordance with that Maori proverb, and as a result of what you've learnt and what operates in New Zealand, that we can make it a better payment system. So, starting with the payment strategy, we heard a lot yesterday of concerns about how New Zealand has begun to lag a little bit in terms of its payments ecosystem in New Zealand, from probably 20 years ago, where people would generally have regarded as world class. Whether that's a fair criticism or not, I don't know, but it certainly seems to be an increasing perception. One of the issues I guess I have in relation to that is really what the role of governments is in payment system, and so in that sense I'm very interested in the report that you did for the Australian government, and probably 2 questions in relation to that. The first is, why did the Australian government do that, and why did they choose you to do that? And then secondly, and certainly an issue I think it's probably in most political systems, what difficulties did you have, or how did you resolve issues of competing government agencies, or with their own agendas and own preferences, to come up with a report which I'm assuming all 15 of those recommendations were unanimously accepted. Well, 14 of them were approved by government, but the agencies on the way through were comfortable. So, Scott, if you'd like to perhaps start with why, and then how you corralled the government agencies.
Yeah, thank you. And you're going to have to come back and remind me the second question if I forget it when I'm answering the first one. You can obviously tell that you're a university lecturer, Simon, because that's an old trick. This is a really good question, and first of all, I'd like to say thank you for everyone who is watching this, who is from New Zealand, who helped me. on these reviews, because the first thing I do when I get appointed to a review is I call a friend. And in fact, I call lots of friends, and they are in at least half a dozen different countries, and they're in the public and private sector. And some people watching have helped me, because the work that I do is just a combination of the ideas of many people put together. I don't agree with the statements that I've heard in New Zealand over the last couple of days where you say that you're lagging, and that you're behind everyone. We are all lagging. We are all lagging something that we don't yet know. A comment was made yesterday about you're hitting a moving target, and it's going to always be moving. And so one of the remarkable things that actually occurred in Australia is that our government saw that things really were changing. And although there was absolutely nothing that was broken, unless we revisited now what we would need for the next 5 to 10 years, we would have something broken and it would be too late for us to fix it. And the core element of that was we no longer had a banking payment system in Australia. We did 20 years ago because the entire system was built around the operations of banks and commercial bank money. And it was already clear as we could see the stresses created in a small way, by things like cryptocurrencies. We could see the impact of innovative payment or credit methods like buy now, pay later. We could see the potential for central bank digital currencies. We could see that people were transferring value in Australia using technology platforms which were entirely operated in other countries, so that we had real transactions in significant numbers which didn't touch any agency or any information collection network that we had. So that came to the point of we need to have a plan about what's happening, and we better look back and see whether what we planned 20 years ago is still everything we need. And the answer was it wasn't.
So where did that come from? Was that from the minister? From where did that sort of we need to look 10 years ahead come from?
It came from the last 5 years in Australia, we've had a genuine idea that one, we need to look more at our digital economy, but most importantly two, we need to look at what are the fundamental building blocks of that economy. So it's not just a soundbite, which it could have easily become in Australia. We're quite good at sound bites in Australia. But it became a question as to what does this mean? And so I'm going to break your rule. We started with CDR and open banking, and then that opened up everything in the sense of we created a system for the transfer of valuable information which had so many different possible outcomes and players that then led to, oh my goodness, what about payments? Because that's the second of the three legs of a digital economy. If we apply the same lens to that, we might need to look a bit more closer. So the way that we did CDR and the way that changed and involved our financial economy led to, well, we need to look at payments too. And that then explains the second part of your first question, which is, well, I was the guy that got to do open banking and CDR, so why don't we see what Scott thinks this time? But importantly, I go back to the point is, I have more than 100, in the case of the second CDR review, more than 200 different meetings to try and pick out what everyone is thinking. And in these areas, you certainly need to, in my view, you need to over-consult to try and find all of the views that you can.
So on that front, do you think using someone from the private sector as opposed to an official created more credibility in that approach, or a different approach? Was that important, or?
It was. I need to try to answer this without talking up myself, right? It would work with you too, so I'll use you. But where it works is that no one is talking with their regulator. They're talking with someone who is not their regulator. It's kind of handy I'm a lawyer because I can keep secrets, right? It's kind of part of my job. Also, on the public sector side, it also allows people to say, when I say something, I'm trying to get answers to questions. Well, it's not the government saying it, so you can't assume this is going to be policy coming forward. And I think the most important thing is to choose someone that has a relatively open mind at the start and really quite curious about where this might go. One of the important things in all of these reviews, and it would probably happen with many people in the private sector, is, well, I don't know everything about this just yet, so I shouldn't start with a view that this is certainly going to be the answer. It does work kind of well, actually, and it also works with someone like you, of course, Simon. You already know lots of people, and you can ask people questions without having to go through a rigorous formality. I mean, you still have to follow proper procedure, but this should be outcomes focused, right? So you want to get enough information so the right decision can be taken for your country.
So did the regulators or the officials have any issue with you, or did you find that it actually wasn't that hard to get them all to understand where their roles were? Did that take a bit of effort, or?
Well, yeah. So the answer to the first.
You weren't an insider.
No, well, not that they told me, but everyone wanted things improved, and so it was really all of these things are like a really big negotiation in the sense of everyone knows that things can be improved. And the most interesting thing about these processes is there's a lot of commonality in what people want. You're quite right. My 16 recommendations were quite well received in the payments review, but I'd been discussing them with people for months as to what they would want in the public and the private sector. Australia is a small country with a small financial system, so we already have a close connection between our private sector and our public sector. We have to, because we're constantly dealing with challenges that come from offshore, and we're not big enough to be able to deal with those just in one government department or just in one bank, for example. So we need that ability to talk. My perception is you have that in New Zealand as well. We use it to our advantage in Australia. I would suggest it's totally open to you to use that to your advantage in New Zealand as well.
Right. Great. So one of the issues sometimes with reports like the ones you've done, and certainly I've been involved in some, including places like IMF, is that they become big doorstops. So you do the report and it's all very interesting, Cabinet ticks it off and then nothing happens. So 1 year on from your payments report, particularly I think what I would see as one of the key recommendations, the need for a payment strategy. Where is that at in Australia? They listened, they approved your recommendations. Now 1 year on, how well is the execution of that strategy working?
It's working pretty well. I think that certainly there's been a lot of work done on that, but what hasn't happened is yet, and I'm really hoping this will happen in the next this calendar year, is opening up the initial work on that strategy for the contribution, not the consultation, but the contribution of the private sector. One of the things we revealed in the payment systems review is that our government is one of the biggest users of payments. And we have a slight disadvantage in Australia as we have multiple layers of governments. And so we have state and federal. And part of a lot of the work in relation to payment strategy was initially internal. So how would we deal with this as the different aspects of the state? Like what aspects of payments can we actually connect to? It would have been, and in the last year we've had a change of our government as well, but our new government seems to be just as supportive as our old government. So I expect that really quite soon it'll be open for contribution by the private sector. An awful lot of work has been done in the public sector so that they can understand their own house as they open this up. But the payment strategy is the first, and I think probably the most critical element, because it allows the private sector to work out how they invest in Australia's payments future. And that was one of the reasons that I was very keen on the strategy, so that people would know what they're building technology for and what technology to, which is why it desperately needs contribution from the private sector as well.
So presumably that means that government and Treasury in particular, given that was your recommendation, have now up-resourced those functions?
Yes, they actually took that recommendation straight away. So any Australian organisations or overseas organisations dealing with the Australian Treasury in relation to payments will have noticed that they're dealing with a much bigger function than they ever have before. And interestingly, that function seemed to be able to recruit quite well, partly because it also includes the way that our government will deal with issues, associated payment issues like stablecoins, CBDCs, even some crypto aspects, where you do need people with different backgrounds who can bring their intellect to bear. So yeah, we've got quicker than I expected, we've got a larger treasury function which is growing in knowledge really quite quickly.
My understanding is that the Australian government, for example, made quite a big actual contribution to the new payments platform, for example. What level of appetite and what role do you think governments have in actually spending? I mean, to my mind, in terms of influencing policy, governments have two tools. One is regulation and the other is the public purse and spending. So to what extent do you see, or has the Australian government, and do you see the Australian government investing in core infrastructure or setting it?
I think there's actually another tool, and it's called influence, where you not only build the standards which govern how people will interact and compete, which could be regulation, but it could be other things too. And you not only can actually own things, but you can actually, by showing what you think is important and making some actions, you can make the private sector understand that this is the way that we will be going. And at that point in time, you can harness the competitiveness, the contestability, the desire for change and the agility in the private sector. I didn't recommend that our government buy any payment systems or anything like that. My view is that the private sector, if it is a competitive private sector, will produce fast and clever results, but it needs to have clear rules around how is the game to be played, and they need to have clear rules about when the rules of that game would change. I'm always cautious and I work for a few different governments, but I won't just pin this on Australia, but I'm always cautious when people suggest to me the solution is spending a heap of taxpayers' money, for example. But I'm also cautious when people say, well, surely this is something which only the private sector can solve. These issues require both. And partly because sometimes in the private sector, you don't know everyone who is supposed to be in that room. You don't know every person who is actually a customer, a potential customer of the payment system, because you are so busy looking after your own customers. And so sometimes you get a breadth of view from the public sector, which is incredibly complementary to the desire for change that you get in the private sector.
So in the Australian context, do you think now you've got a regime, or you're getting to a regime where, and like New Zealand, probably it's going to be the big four banks that will particularly bear the costs of these things, where they might have enough certainty or investment return, and you don't get what I think people call the prisoner's dilemma, where none of them want to invest until they're sure that all are going to invest, whether you've got that.
We're on the path to that. That is a fundamental, important outcome of the payment strategy. So that gives that. For example, we have a range of different systems in Australia, and they won't exist forever, because they will become outdated. And we should have a shared idea of the rough timing of that, so people know how to spend, and most importantly, not misspend the money for doing that. When we get to that point, we've provided the regulatory nudge we need to solve the prisoner's dilemma. But in both data and money, the job is never done. The world is changing too much. So something which I always feel I have to be really careful about is policy in this area is not set and forget. It is like you're constantly changing and improving in this regard. And the reason I mention that is you could hit another roadblock where something you didn't expect requires some kind of concerted action. And yet again, we need to work out, okay, well, you find it trouble working together. I'll call the meeting. I'll tell you what we want to happen. And then you can work out how you want that to happen. And you can actually challenge me as to whether we want that to happen, which is, again, I'll put you on the hook, Simon. That's kind of how a partnership works, right? And we always talk about public-private partnerships, but sometimes they're not real partnerships. And you desperately need it in this area if you are a small country like Australia, and I suspect you probably would be handy in a country like New Zealand as well.
I mean, we heard yesterday a little bit about the sort of theory of co-opetition. I mean, this is almost co-opetition with state and private sector actors working together to create a...
And that's super important, right? Because the way that I see it is this is a complex system, a genuine complex system. We have multiple different parties. They all play different roles. They can change. They can adjust to different circumstances. That's how we get innovation. Of course, complex systems can also be robust and fragile. So we actually do need to have some rules of the game that shows what we're going to do if things get into trouble. But those complex systems work because different parties are bouncing off each other, creating new ideas. Some of them can be public sector entities. There's no rule that they can't. If Australia is going to be a truly mature digital economy, it's got to get used to that and welcome the fact that, if we are a team on a field, some of the players sometimes are public sector and they're playing along private sector players.
One of the other things that you recommended in your report was a reform of the licensing arrangements in Australia. Now, we don't really even have them here in New Zealand, but so and again, if we talk about how the field evolves, you've got actors who, even if a decade or so, the Apples and the Googles, who are starting to get involved in payments, who are not licensed against, in New Zealand at least, when banks are. So what, I guess, do you have, I guess, what role do you see a licensing regime playing in terms of creating a credibility for a payment system? And based on what you've recommended in Australia, what do you think is the kind of licensing regime that works best in the payments area?
Yeah, and so my answer to this, Simon, I'm going to restrict to what I think is right in Australia. You can draw your own conclusions for New Zealand. I'm a guest here. I'm not going to say anything about New Zealand. So a fundamental thing that came out of the payments review was that it's an ecosystem now and not a system. So there's lots of people performing functions. And if you ask a lawyer using old-fashioned law, they'll say this is a payment, and that doesn't really matter if people think that something else is a payment too. Mm-hmm. And so what is the license about? The license is about, it's not that dissimilar to a driver's license. There's a lot more roads out there than we thought. You need a driver's license to go on these roads. Why do you need a license to these roads? Because you've got other people driving on the roads, and they'd like to know that you're going to keep to the left rather than moving to the right. But if you are in Australia, because we're going to have small and big licenses, if you're driving an 18-wheel truck along that road, we have different standards for you because you could cause some serious damage to other people. The critical element of that is, so what is the functions that you're talking about, Scott? What is a payments function? That's genuinely hard. In the review, I list the functions in 6 other jurisdictions, none of which on their own is quite good enough to deal with what functions might be performed by payments in the future. It could be the functions performed by technology companies. It could be the functions performed by decentralized technology. It goes back to the point as to every single one of my reviews has to be read from the customer's perspective. Now, for payments, the customer is both the consumer and the business that receives the money. And probably the hardest message I give people in payments and in data is, and when I'm doing these reviews, is it's not about you. It's about the people you serve. And if you haven't worked out the people you serve, or you've forgotten, you need to go back to it, because I haven't forgotten that. And this whole system has got to be about the people you serve. And sometimes in an industry as complex as and nuanced as payments, people do forget the only reason for existing is so that real people can buy stuff from businesses or send money to each other. And sometimes those real people don't really care what lawyers like me would think a payment is, and actually they do stuff that they think is a payment, and quite frankly, they should have the confidence that they have in using other means of payment, because if they don't, then all of a sudden they will start to mistrust all sorts of things. So we are not there yet as to what the payment functions are. We are going to be consulting on that, but I do know that what we currently have isn't enough for the future, because things are changing quite fast. But I have some confidence that real people always know when they're making a payment, and that's a good benchmark to start with.
So presumably, in some senses, what almost goes back to one of the core presentations yesterday. This is about trust, isn't it? So at the end of the day, how do you create a framework and where everybody you've got, whether it's a trademark or a trust mark or something that ensures that the people you are dealing with you can trust.
On on 2 of my 3 reviews, there's 4 words on the front cover, and they're always really important. And the last word is always confidence.
Yep.
People need confidence in using that. I didn't put it on the payments review because we didn't have to drive home so much with money as we did with data. That this is a trust-based framework or a trustworthiness-based framework, and indeed a lot of what Rachel said yesterday rings home just as true in payments as it does in data frameworks. That some people would say that actually the entire banking system is a confidence trick because the bank is lending out multiple times the money that it has. The clue's in the title. You've got to have confidence that the system works, because if it doesn't, it all unravels backwards. How do we make sure that works in a changing world? Well, we don't sit back and say, well, we're not going to engage with that world. That will certainly reduce trust. We somehow have to work out little by little to put trust into the areas where Australians and potentially New Zealanders are already functioning, already making payments or transfers of value. And it's my job, in my view, it's the public and private sector's job to provide that, because that's part of the function for those that they serve.
It's probably a good segue into the open banking and CDR review. As Steve mentioned at the outset, you did the initial review. Was it open banking or CDR? I can't remember what you called the first one.
The first one was open banking in 2017.
In 2017, yep. And then what's always struck me as kind of appealing in a way is that they then got you to criticise your own implementation 4 years later. Yep. With a review of what yep. happened. So always nice to criticise your own work several years later.
And I found lots of mistakes in what I did. Yeah,
so nice to have that opportunity. And obviously it's become very topical this morning. Sadly, not yesterday when the Minister, I think, was hoping to announce it, but did this morning announce open banking in New Zealand. One of the things I had a look at briefly, and interestingly, probably 2 of the 3 comments were questions I was probably going to ask you anyway, was the NZBA press release in relation to open banking. And in that press release, it talks about the fact that, yes, it's been announced, but there is a lot of detail to be included, and they particularly focus on things like privacy and data security. I know from discussions we've had before, data integrity is also one of those things that you would think is quite important. So in terms of having the work you've done, and look, Steve mentioned a little bit earlier, but I understand you've also helped places like Canada, Japan, Hong Kong, England, Philippines. So you've done seen a lot of these regimes. So in terms of those details, what are the things you think we need to be conscious of in New Zealand, and where you think best practice might have morphed in terms of?
So the great thing about engaging with the consumer data right regime or an open banking regime is it gives you an avenue to have consistent and usually enforceable standards relating to critical things like data protection, information security, and other information integrity. In all the places that I've worked on this, the answer to those questions about, well, what about data protection is, yeah, isn't it great to have an opportunity to get that right and to create the standard in your country that other things can be benchmarked against? And the other good thing is, and we did this too, is you can take, because things like information security is not an issue that belongs to one country. We are all subject to the same issues because data and data attacks don't recognise borders. Is you get to see and you can use what other people have already created. Our InfoSec standards are really quite heavily based on the United Kingdom because there was nothing about our account structure, our data structure, our client structure, the fact that ours is economy-wide, which meant that the information security, which was top-notch for the UK, we couldn't grab that. And then we kept updating it as the standards, international standards on which that were based, are upgraded. And so it's, I'm utterly delighted. I was utterly delighted to read this morning that you're doing this because you are, as you do this, you will show us again how we can improve. So you will find some things, and we can upgrade to that. And that's the way Canada will do it. It's already the way the UK does it, because UK and Australia are now swapping standards. But one thing in relation to your question is keep in mind you'll be constantly improving this. But again, I'll come back to my comment about Australia being a small country. We so need the rest of the world to be working on this too, because we just don't have the grunt to keep up to date with everything. So we need to make sure that we are relying on what everyone else is doing in this regard. In relation to data protection, it's a given. I mean, you can't have confidence in something like the CDR unless you have a data protection framework. It's not that hard. We actually improved the data protection of our Privacy Act when we put in place our CDR legislation. It's got elements of GDPR in it, but it's not GDPR because unlike GDPR, we wanted our consumer data right to facilitate transactions in value and not just prevent them. There's a discussion that every country needs to have with itself on that, because issues like data protection are actually issues of culture as to what is the relationship between New Zealand people and their data. But on issues like information security, you can usually go to the shop, get the best item on the shelf. Sometimes that'll be what you've done, but keep going back to the shop to find out actually what's the best version of this now. We'll take that one.
How do you stop the potential risk of over-engineering that, so it's all about data security and then it becomes unusable because the data security elements just become too hard to...
So this is where the policy discussion has to be balanced, and it has to be balanced around why are we doing this? What are we trying to enable? And in my view, you're trying to enable three things at the same time. You're trying to enable the autonomy of the customer to make choices. You're trying to enable the portability of data to put into effect those choices. And you're trying to enable the accountability of the recipient so they're responsible for what they do with that data. And you've got to keep in mind, and they will achieve your objectives of competition, innovation, inclusion, and consumer protection. Now, if you have those three choices in a triangle and you only focus on one, you've unbalanced your entire system, and you might be super safe, but why are you doing this? Because it's not actually going to necessarily help competition and innovation. And that's why what worked really quite well in Australia is we had multiple policy agencies under the supervision of the lead department, which could bring those points of view. If it were the responsibility of just one agency, they would not necessarily have all those perspectives in mind. Plus, we had the private sector working quite closely with the public sector in the construction of the standards.
So my understanding is that initially, for example, it was our equivalent of the Commerce Commission that had responsibility for the consumer data right, but that changed. Was that in part in response to that challenge?
The ACCC is still very much involved, but it doesn't have the same policy authority to change the middle part of our structure, which are the rules. And one reason for that is that regulators are constrained by what they are formed to do. And in any formation of policy, there's always going to be a balance between risk and return. It's a rare regulator that likes balancing risk and return anywhere but let's have no risk, for example. It turned out that Treasury, because it is a government department that is responsible for our economy, was quite familiar with the fact that on a holistic basis, sometimes there are some risks in order to get a better return. You have to manage the risks, but you can't make them go away. Also, you need to balance lots of stakeholders' interests, including people who want to be empowered, and not everyone wants to be protected. And that's what our government departments are created to do, is to make those balancing decisions. But you're right, we had to change that. Yep. But we're into our 5th iteration of our rules, and we won't stop there because we are not geniuses. Like, we cannot predict the future, but one thing we got super right is when we spot a mistake, it's a good idea to change it and address that. And that's why when we do this, this will probably keep iterating all the time. But that's not surprising because so is the digital economy. There's no way I could ever invent a series of rules which would be perfect for the next 10 years. It would be beyond me. It'd be beyond many people, I would think. But a group of people that are allowed to keep upgrading things, yeah, that works.
So one of the other comments made by the NZBA this morning is of the importance of learning lessons from other countries. Now, you've talked a little bit about that already, but you talk about Australia as a small country. Now, if Australia's a small country, we're tiny, because we're about the size of population terms, Sydney or Melbourne. Is this a case like we have for food standards, for example, where there might make sense to have a common framework across both countries in order to help each other stay up to date.
Firstly, don't take my comments as a desire to digitally colonise New Zealand, right? In fact, I think this is an area where there is a strong case for comparative advantage. We should really have trade in the way that we do this. Clearly, interoperability, to the extent possible, in the actual technological way that we do this, would benefit businesses and consumers in both of our countries. I would suggest it would benefit your fintech sector if they develop what they need to meet the New Zealand CDR, they could then offer it to 26 million Australian customers across the ditch because it's in the same sort of system. There are cultural elements you can't change, and we should make sure we preserve fundamental rules of policy that are needed to actually, they make us who we are. But on other aspects, to the extent you can use our stuff as a base because we've already made a bunch of mistakes, and I've been meeting with people here to tell them about the mistakes at least I've made in this process. But there'll be a two-way street, right? So you should suspect me back in a year's time to say, could you tell me what you messed up? Because we would like not to mess up in the same way. On a philosophical basis, except for the fact that we have different cultures and different relationships with our data, this should be a little like, when I drive here, I drive on the same side of the road. Your traffic lights are kind of similar. They're not Aussie's traffic lights, they're just the traffic lights that actually work in our places. And I can't, if that's going to benefit New Zealand and New Zealanders, go for it. But I do like the idea that these standards are quite common between our countries, because that means if there is an improvement, we've got two sets of people looking at it to see what the improvement is.
Of the countries you've looked at, do you think anyone is further ahead than anywhere else, or are we all making different mistakes?
No, I don't. I mean, some countries like to say that. I'm always quite cautious if people from my country start to say we're ahead and think, well, there's no ahead, right? There's only how good is this for Australian people. There are very different paths. So the United Kingdom, for example, is a very narrow path where it's based on payments alone. That's why it's under the Payment Services Regulation, or PSD2, it's pay for payments. And they've got narrow and deep.
Yep.
We are only doing payments now as we go into action initiation. But when we go into action initiation, we're also looking at opening and closing accounts. And the first energy data holders started yesterday. So it'll be looking at energy accounts as well. So why did we do that? Because actually when we look at Australia, if we have a cost of living problem, people don't just have a cost of living problem maybe with their mortgages and their credit cards, they also have it with their energy bills and their telco bills, for example. So different policy objectives. How could you say that one is ahead of the other? Well, none of us are going to have, Australia's CDR is never going to be competition for New Zealand's in New Zealand. So it becomes a question as to how well are you performing against what you wanted for your own people. And what, as Canada does its work, it'll be really interesting, because I think Canada will have little bits of Australia and little bits of the UK, maybe even a little bit of the very laissez-faire system in the US. And the way they put those together could be really handy for all of us as to what we put in our own country. And that's where that distinction between the standards or the technical language we use to put this into place, and then the policy or how the scope and scale of what we're doing could be different. And maybe we'll get to the point where we all cover everything. We will take different journeys depending on what's most important to our people in each country at that time.
When the Bank of International Settlements, I think, did their open banking analysis a couple of years ago, they had sort of a stack of governance models, with Australia probably at the peak of the most governed model. It does seem to me, and again interested in your thoughts, that increasingly the people that have adopted a self-governance approach are finding that they really do need effectively whether it's the cover or the certainty created by regulation. And obviously that's been the path which the Minister has now clearly decided to take here in New Zealand.
That is my experience in working with other countries. If it is entirely voluntary, and this is not because people just don't want to do it, it's just hard to solve the coordination problem. and the guidance as to, well, there's no point in arguing about that because we're going to have to do it, and this is about how we do it. That makes investment decisions easier. It also, for some organisations, it makes it easier for them to get funding to do this thing. We just have to do it. And so the balance, what seems to work quite well in a lot of countries is you're going to do it, but you get to be involved in how we do it. So I'm cautious when I work with a country that says, well, we're going to tell them exactly how they're going to do this. And, well, how do you know? And so with voluntary systems, they haven't been that successful. We're still early, but the ones which seem to be moving ahead are ones where the first decision about, oh, do we really want to do this, is no longer a decision. It helps people get through the 5 stages of grief in open banking. You know, the first one's denial. So, well, there's no point in denying it because it's actually going to happen. Let's move on to the next stage.
Just interested again, and we going back to probably the data protection point a little bit, but increasingly we are seeing even state actors involved in cyber attacks and other areas. So to what extent is the private sector even able to necessarily universally have standards that will protect themselves against, let's say, a cyber attack from North Korea or Russia? And how do we protect that to preserve confidence in where there will be an awful lot of data that?
And this is a super important question. But there's a really critical first issue, and that is context. Where are we now? And the analogy I always use, and I must apologise to the audience who've heard me say this before, is this is not a case that we're just going to all of a sudden open up a new beach for swimming. We're already swimming. And we're already sharing data, we're already having people hold data, and quite frankly, in this analogy, we're already in dangerous surf. And so in relation to cybersecurity, structures like CDR are really about setting up a new set of red and yellow flags. Like, actually, if your data's in this system, we've got standards for InfoSec, which means, you know, you're still swimming in the ocean, but we've got lifeguards watching, because we've got regulators and we've got participants, so it's just going to be a bit better. But if we close the beach, people are still going to swim. And so the question becomes not, can we get information security perfect? Is, can this actually improve where we are? Because my understanding, I'm not a technologist, is the constant contest in relation to information security will not end, and will constantly be involved, and I'm sure a lot of organisations who are watching this know this. And what this does is add both coordination and also a method of actually having a conversation if there is an attack, plus a way of keeping up to date. It doesn't have to be the only way, but this is about, to go back to my analogy, now we have lifeguards there, and you know these lifeguards actually have jet skis too, so they can come out and rescue swimmers. I can continue this analogy forever, right?
Yeah.
So I've been running it for 5 years.
It's on a Manly Beach.
So, but it's important that context, because sometimes I deal with public sector officers who imagine that this is not already happening. And quite frankly, the burning platform in relation to CDR and open banking it comes from an awareness of how much sharing of data, storage of data, and losing of data already exists. And it's that it's in response to, as well as empowering customers to make those decisions more effective.
Do you have any suggestions about how? So,
with information security, there are good InfoSec standards. And my personal view is issues with InfoSec can arise because businesses are not already using those standards because, for a start, they don't understand they're a data business. Nearly every business is now a data business. Or secondly, they don't know what to do when the unexpected happens. And Simon, if we had this discussion and we weren't talking about data, but we were talking about money, and there was a collapse of a bank in a financial system, you and I would say immediately, we need a default management program. Like, we should have that in advance. We should have war-gamed this, because actually everyone's going to have to chip in and make sure the system doesn't collapse just because we use a bank. If you take the word money out and put the word data in, we need that kind of response. They're both valuable information. That's what we're talking about. CDR is, in Australia, is a way of making that conversation more real. But it is a conversation that large companies are having with each other now, and we're just learning as we go.
Any thoughts on, because one of the issues I think sometimes comes up with consumer data is that consumers don't know what the worth of their data is. I mean, I know what the worth of the money in my bank account is, but I don't know the worth of the data that my bank holds with me. Any thoughts around how, if I'm giving my consent, for example, that I have some sort of transparency around what value I am consenting to giving away? Or
well, that's a really good thing about, if just say that you introduce this in the same way that we did, where data can only be used for the purpose that the person has consented, which also must be in connection with the good or service the person has requested, which is quite an interesting formulation. It means that no longer is data something that you give away to get a service. It's got to be an input into a good or a service. And why that's really important is the value of data is subjective. So for different uses, particular kinds of data about me could have different values. But the way that we've constructed it, and it's the way that it's constructed effectively under PSD2, we're just being clearer, is I know what value this is going to give because it's got to be used for the good or service that I've asked for. And once that's done, you're done. Delete it. And that's because a piece of data about you might be worth less than 1 cent or maybe more than $100,000, depending on how it's used or misused. That ability to put customers or consumers in charge of how it's used in a way they can understand is actually fundamental. But you are very right. By understanding how this use of data contributes to something they value, maybe people will start to learn that the data itself is valuable, and maybe they'll then learn that maybe I should be looking after it as if it were valuable. That's a long process, but again, we've got to start on that process because, like, the rest of our lives are going to have more and more data involved. So we do need to become aware of how it can be used, how it can be misused, and how valuable it is.
Excellent.
5 more minutes.
I've got 5 more minutes?
Yeah,
okay. Well, we'll be talking about data. I mean, you mentioned, for example, destruction of data, and again, one of the things that if you have transferred your data and an entity has failed, and there is a cost to doing that, how do you ensure that that happens? Or again, when it's money, it's easier because there's a claims process. But when you're sitting in a
and this is really interesting, right? And so, although data is valuable, it is information, just like money. Most money is just information. It does respond differently to this kind of thing because I can, if I do something that causes you value in money, I can give you money back because it's fungible. Yeah. If I do something that causes you to lose value of your data because I give it to someone else, how the heck do I give it back? It's non-rivalrous. I can't really get it back. But one of the things to understand is the equivalent of repaying money in holding data is called deleting it. Because deletion removes the future possibility of misuse, which causes a loss of value. It's like giving it back, for example. But you raise another good point, which is what if I've already sent it somewhere else? And that's where it becomes this process of I can't just pay people for the damage I've caused in relation to a misuse of data. I might have to help them try and fix up the damage I've done. And if I've become insolvent and there are people being hurt, then we're going to have to work out how everyone who is left can actually help recover identities and do these things. Because if we don't, people will lose confidence in the system. And we need people to have not only trust in the people they've chosen to share data with, but confidence in the system so that there is an ability to repair wrongs if they arise. That sounds hard. Yeah, like this stuff is hard, but we still have to do it. And some of the things that we've learnt in payments and banking can be moved across because over the last 100 or so years, we've learnt so many lessons from financial crises and loss of banks and those things. We actually have a lot of tools for managing the unexpected. Many of those can be used, but sometimes people sort of want to give up at the start. Oh, it's all too hard and everyone will have the information and it'll all be gone. Well, we can't do that, can we? Like we've got to keep fighting on for the people that we serve. So, and what is interesting is we've solved lots of these problems before. There's just some at the edges. We need to be a bit creative about how we help people.
Great. Now, Steve, I think you've got a question, have you?
Did you any other closing comments, Simon, or
other than a thank you?
Scott?
That's been very helpful. We've grabbed his basket of knowledge. We haven't given him our basket back yet, but that's for another day.
Yeah, well, we've certainly got a pretty big basket in terms of where New Zealand's at in our open banking journey with the work that's been done through the API Centre, and you would have heard an update on that earlier in the afternoon. So we certainly welcome the announcement this morning and looking forward to working with the Minister and officials in terms of progressing where things are at once we get a better understanding of what's actually in the legislation that's coming out in the first quarter of 2023. But our hope is that it will accelerate and build on the work that the industry has been doing over the last 3 to 4 years, which is first class. So thank you very much both for coming here today and sharing your views and knowledge, both in terms of payments regulation and the topic of the day around the CDR as well. And look forward to seeing what the next 12 months brings for both jurisdictions on that front as well. So thank you very much. And a good way to end the Point 2022 online series. The session has been recorded, so if you had to duck out for a cup of tea, cup of coffee, or take a phone call, you'll still be able to see what you missed. Thanks also for the sponsors of the Point 2022. Really thank your support over the last 2 days in terms of encouraging the involvement and participation in the Point. And I also would like to send a big thanks to those who have been with us over the last 2 days. I do hope, and I know, that you would have had a lot of information coming through too. It would have certainly pricked your curiosity. I hope you're now energised to bring that forward, and I hope you've made learnings that you can take back into your organisation and input into the strategies that have been development around payments and delivering innovations to both consumers and businesses of Aotearoa. It's been a really good, exciting and energising 2 days from Payments NZ perspective, and the feedback we've been getting over the last period has been really positive in terms of how others have engaged and been involved with the last 2 days and getting together again, which has been fantastic to see the energy in the room yesterday with the industry coming together and enjoying themselves and learning and having a good time last night at the gala dinner. So thank you very much. And I think in closing, I would like to say karakia for the end of the day. Me karakia tātou, ko amutu au tātou mahi, mo tēnei rā, hui e, tai ki e. In short, that really says we have come to the end of our work today. Our work is finished. And certainly the Point 22, the work for that has finished, and look forward to seeing you all again in, unbelievably, the Point 2024. Thank you very much.